because up is good as well. And I don't think it's an or discussion ever when we're talking about these topics. It's an and discussion.
Are you interested in cities as places for experiments? What do you think about respectful disagreements? How can we create good partnerships between different stakeholders? Stay tuned for answers from Sally Capp.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Sally Capp, non-executive director of Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne and the former Lord Mayor of Melbourne. We will talk about her vision for the future of cities, the need for respect for disagreements, multifunctional spaces and places, the role of the government, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Sally Capp is an accomplished leader with extensive experience across both private and public sectors. She was the first woman to be directly elected as Lord Mayor of Melbourne, where she led the city through the pandemic, gaining valuable crisis management expertise. Sally has a strong background in stakeholder engagement, ESG initiatives, and governance, having worked in senior roles at KPMG, ANZ, and as CEO of the Committee for Melbourne. She co-founded a business that was later listed on the ASX and served as Victoria's Agent General in the UK, Europe, and Israel. A University of Melbourne graduate with degrees in law and commerce, she made history in 2004 as the first female board member of Collingwood FC. Passionate about philanthropy, Sally is on the board of the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Research Institute and supports several charities. She is backed by her husband, Andrew, and their sons, Will and Nick. And with that, Sally, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. Let's jump right into the first, and I assume a big question for you. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on this podcast, which I think we're up to 296 episodes. Woohoo! That must be getting close to some sort of Guinness World Record. And I'm not surprised because cities is such an all-encompassing, interesting topic. And I really thank you for providing a forum within which we can have these important discussions. So great to be here. I feel very excited about the future of cities. I'm a naturally hopeful and optimistic person, but I think there's plenty of data and evidence now to really show that the future of cities is in many ways inevitable. It was 2007, I remember distinctly. I'd just become the CEO of a policy group called the Committee for Melbourne. And the UN came out with some data that showed for the first time in human history, more people were living in urban or city environments than any time in history. And that trend, of course, has continued. I believe at the moment about 56% of the world's population live in urban environments, and that by 2050 it's predicted that 7 out of 10 people will live in cities. And this pace of people being attracted to urban environments, which I'm sure we'll be talking about, as I said, I think inevitable. And therefore it's important that we're talking about it and that we are managing for that. And I think it's full of possibilities and excitement. But it does take an enormous energy to grab hold of something that has its own momentum, like the flight to cities, and to be able to add in deliberate, thoughtful, benchmark, best in breed, try new things, all those sorts of elements that need to happen that are part of leadership and really providing direction and guidance. And that is hard when there's a momentum. And I note that in Australia, we've for a very long time been one of the most urbanised populations in the world. And we're close to about 87% urbanised in Australia. So these issues I think are even more prevalent and critical for us to be asking important questions and also responding with thoughtfulness and deliberate action.
Before we go into the specifics, what does the city mean to you?
Look, city is for me a very happy place. Let's start with that. And I love urban environments because I love people. And let's face it, cities are all about people. We often think of cities as the physical infrastructure or physical places, and that is important. I think those physical environments are a key component in what makes good cities or bad cities for that matter. But cities at the end of the day are about people, and that's why I really love cities. I also acknowledge and really appreciate the energy that comes. I mentioned momentum before, but the energy that comes from having people en masse and the possibilities. I've been involved in discussions before where the question's been posed, what wouldn't have been invented if there weren't cities? And there are so many great examples. One of the sister cities of Nanjing that I've been able to visit, I was absolutely fascinated by their museum around writing and paper making, which really set off global communication in incredible ways. The stories of industrialisation in the UK really driven by the steam train and the ability to get goods and people transferred out and to other places happened in the city environments of Liverpool and Manchester. And even in Melbourne, I just loved learning more about the credibility of our innovation, but invention in Melbourne as a city over the last getting up to 200 years, 186, I think it is now, in its newest form, and the inventions of things like Wi-Fi that have had global significance, of frozen embryos. The 8-hour workday movement started in Melbourne, and of course Vegemite was invented in Melbourne. I'm not sure that has global status, but it fascinates me sometimes to think in the reverse. What wouldn't we have if we didn't have cities? And one of the things I love about cities is that energy and that sense of possibilities when humans collide. It could be organised or it could be serendipitous. It's the sparks and the way that we can actually add value to each other's thinking, each other's actions that leads to progress. To me, cities are really about people and progress.
Does this have a not happy part? Because you started your answer with, let's start with the happy parts.
Yeah, I think it's really important always to acknowledge that there's a never-ending list, frankly, of things that need to be improved. I think the scale and collaboration that can happen in cities means that we can address issues, but we also see societal issues heightened in city environments as well. And the concept of equity is really not discussed enough. I think when we say cities are about people, and let's face it, we choose to be organised in these ways and we choose to come into these environments and we choose who is going to represent us and the decisions they make, and we choose the actions that we take every day. From the macro to the micro, there's a lot here about the choices that we make. But by virtue of some of the ways in which we act and we organise, there are deep inequities. And I think we need to have the equity discussion more prevalent in our planning, our thinking, our daily discussions, and really our goals and ambitions for what we want to achieve in cities. And from my perspective, that's the platform piece to then deal with some of the really big issues for cities, like responding to climate change and protecting environment, like housing and homelessness, like food insecurity, all of those issues. In some ways, those issues are caused by cities as well, but cities absolutely have to be, therefore, forefront and leading on the solutions. So from my perspective, there's a circularity to this. And in so many discussions, it's either going to be a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle. And I think the more we identify through podcasts like this, and the more that we identify and discuss these issues and we have them out in the open and we can acknowledge the challenges and the fears and the inequities and show that those efforts and the commitment to addressing those as we see that progress, that's a really key part of what we experience in cities, but really what can be achieved in cities.
Equity, like many other fancy urban terms, are very multifaceted. What is equity for you?
Equity is about fairness. We really strive in so many ways for equality across isms. And I get that. That's what we're striving for, everybody to have equal opportunity or equal access or an equal sense of what's possible, a sense of equality across genders and age groups and demographics of all sorts. Even equality across resources available within city environments or regional rural environments, all of this sort of concept of equality. But basically, you can't get to equality without a really big commitment to equity. Equity is allocating resources to those that need it more as we strive towards equality. Equity is about fairness, which doesn't mean that everybody gets the same. It doesn't mean that everybody is the same. And it's really recognising that we're all at different stages of our personal journeys and abilities, and also at societal level where we're all at different stages. So how do we have really mature conversations around equity? And there are so many examples of this. When we talk about equity, the quickest picture I can describe to people is two people trying to look over a fence, and one is tall enough to see over the fence without any assistance and another person isn't. And therefore, the equitable action is to provide them with steps so that they can lift themselves up to have the same view over the fence. In city discussions, there are so many examples of where equity is necessary to overcome poverty, discrimination, to people towards equal access and opportunity. And it can be at an individual level, a city level, or even a national level. When I've been involved in international discussions about the impacts of climate change, the need for investment in the South Pacific is overwhelming. For them to have, even before we get to equality issues, for them to be able to survive as they know it. And that's not necessarily where we see the resources going, of course. Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere, even on where investment in climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And then as Lord Mayor, and now being much more aware, not just of local government and its role, but local community, the inequity that we can see day to day is something that we need to address. For me, we can't really have a big discussion about progress through cities, which I'm optimistic and excited about, without addressing the fact that we've really got to put more investment and effort into equity.
Is equity a cause or a symptom? Because in your picture, when you describe the fence, that might be just a wrong question or a wrong solution, because it might be a temporary solution that someone is provided by steps. But if we switch the fence to something which you can see through, then nobody needs the steps.
Sure. We'd still have to take some sort of action to achieve the equity. And is it a cause or a symptom? At various times, it's both. Cities over time have represented places of opportunity for people that come with a lot, but also for people that come with nothing. There are so many of those stories, but it's the sense of fairness and understanding that real progress, and frankly, cities that we want to live in and we want to work in and that we want to experience, are cities where there's more equity and more equality than not. We often talk about, and it's true, economic indicators are key indicators of progress and success. And I'm all for those indicators. I love all that stuff. I think they're important drivers for actions and investments and responses. But they're not the only drivers, and they can also mask other elements that can lead to longer term deterioration of the success of cities over time. I know in Melbourne, for example, that despite the significant disruption of the pandemic, we've seen key economic indicators like gross local product climb and continue to reach forecasts. Pre-COVID, the gross local product of the city actually had just hit a new record at $104 billion, about 25% of the state's economy. In June 2024, despite losing about a quarter of that value during the pandemic, the city GLP hit $120 billion. And the city economy, or the economy of the municipality, that's the City of Melbourne, is forecast to reach $150 billion by 2031. So we see those key economic indicators, which are very strong, and they're indicators we've all worked really hard to contribute to. But on the other hand, we've seen mental health issues up. We see food insecurity up. We see access to housing continue to be a major issue in the city. The necessity to respond to climate change and particularly more extreme weather events. And when I think of, for example, heat and responding to heat, those in lower socioeconomic groups and also older demographics are the most impacted by heat. And it's actually the biggest sort of natural killer of people in a lot of developed cities around the world, which surprises people because I think when I first started learning about this, I imagined it was in the desert, but actually it's in our cities for lots of reasons, which we can talk about if you're interested. But regardless, the point I'm making is we can have very strong indicators of progress on economic and at the same time see a deterioration of other elements of the city, knowing that we need all of those working well or better. Nothing's ever perfect to enhance people's lives, but really the ongoing success and vibrancy of the city environment. I have never been to Detroit in the US, but I've spoken to a lot of people, and I think it was in 2023, they held a UN conference in that city because post the downturn in the car manufacturing market, Detroit became a ghost town by all accounts. And people wondered whether this was the future of cities. They've managed to turn themselves around into a multifaceted, multidimensional, wonderful, by all accounts, city by adding all of the other elements that are important to people. It is about work, of course, but it's also about culture and access to health and to education, and it's about quality of housing and proximity of housing to work and other services, and it's about being able to have fun and being able to access nature, and for people to feel they can realise their own personal potential in the context of the broader society. Bringing all of that together into cities is absolutely critical. And whilst in their history, they might have been flying at one point on those economic indicators without investing in the other parts, they could see how quickly their fortunes changed. And I think being very deliberate and thoughtful about how we continue to invest in all of those aspects that really are about people at the end of the day is important.
Coming back to your first answer regarding the future of cities, because you were also talking about how cities are bringing in more people, how they are very important for these indicators and how they are causing the problems but can be also the solutions. Have you thought about a possibility where the city is not the future? Because, for example, in COVID, we experienced how the city can be a ghost town and how people can just work from home, can just work from the suburbs. We don't need to go into the CBD. And the current technologies are making it possible to live off the grid, live wherever you want, because you can have energy, you can have internet, you can have water, you can have everything you want in a city. Is the city, in your imagination, definitely the future of humanity?
Yeah. It's been the evolution of humanity. It's been at the forefront of civilization, and every major step we've taken forward has come from when people are together. They don't have to be in capital city environments. I think it's really urban environments that I would use that interchangeably with cities. And it's really important that we continue to come together as humanity to discuss and debate big issues and to work together to invent and innovate. And socialisation, it's such a key part of who we are. There are the intangibles as well. There's the sense of identity and the overcoming of isolation and loneliness and a sense of unity and cohesion that even in times of conflict, we continue to search for. It's often what drives the resolution, even if it takes too long, of so many big things. But it's an interesting topic to talk about now because there are so many incredible disruptions and disasters being experienced around the world, and they are impacting cities disproportionately. So in Melbourne, as one of the most locked down cities in the world, that sense of exodus from the city as a result of lockdown, not just during, but also particularly immediately after the sea changes and the tree changes and the way that technology can really underpin different lifestyle choices. We've, of course, got conflict in areas around the world, which is devastating cities and populations in the most traumatic of ways. We've got other cities around the world experiencing other types of disaster, like natural disasters, which we're seeing more and more. Hurricanes, for example. These occurrences are really, I'm not saying that they're only happening now. Of course, they've happened throughout history. But I really feel like there are a lot that humanity is dealing with at the moment. In that way, I think civilization and humans have been incredibly resilient. And what I think is important to be focusing on, and certainly something that has been a central part of discussions in Melbourne more broadly, is how do you use that time of disruption to create something better? Because you can't waste a crisis, as the saying goes. The great oracle Homer Simpson calls it a crisis-opportunity, and we've really got to make sure as leaders and as individuals that we really take the learnings and we do better. And again, history is a great teacher in many ways. I lived in London for a while, became absolutely fascinated because I've been in the property sector as well. You know, that the great fires that tore through London and devastated at the time resulted in a new planning approach that improved living conditions. I love New York, and I love the stories that the subway came after a great it was a snowstorm, winter weather that restricted travel by road and rail above ground. So they started underground railway, and it's still, I think, the biggest subway system in the world. And those examples go back centuries, of course. But here we are today, and we are or have just been or are going through major shifts in our lifetimes. And we've really got to use, I think, cities as a platform for creating better. So for me, that's one of the opportunities. It's the reinvention, it's the sense of progress, and it's really addressing those tough issues and being collaborative and coordinated and cooperative in how we respond to those as humans. That's not always easy because we're seeing a divergence in thinking and ideology as well. But I think on the whole, particularly in democracies, we're able to see people move and shape and actually influence the future in positive ways. So we can't not leverage the devastation of the situations that we are encountering to really dedicate ourselves to something that's better. And in that way, see if we can make not just step change, but leap changes in some of the global issues that we're facing. I mentioned climate change earlier. Cities contribute, I think, more than 75% of the world's emissions. It's disgusting. And therefore, we have to be part of the solution. And certainly one of our ambitions during my time at the City of Melbourne was to be right at the forefront of being a centre of renewable energy. And again, we often think of renewable energy in regional rural environments because that's where the physical assets are located. How do we make sure we're turbocharging that by utilising the scale that exists and the know-how that exists at scale in cities? And that combination is really important. Housing is another big global issue being experienced around the world, whatever environment you're in. Having access to a safe, secure place to sleep at night is absolutely essential for anyone to function and be productive and feel a sense of dignity and hope in their lives. And how we use city environments. I would love to see us experiment more. I think city environments have the right sort of components to be able to take more risk. We can afford to take more risk, and we should in trying some of these new things. So for me, it is also a time for reinvention, for taking or doing more experiments and for tackling, using those elements as platforms to tackle some of the really big issues that we're experiencing globally. I come back to equity as well. I think equity really needs to drive and does drive a lot of the motivation, inspiration and investment to address these issues.
You also mentioned at the beginning that you think people are choosing where they live, who they vote for, what they wear, what they buy. And I would love to understand, what do you think, whether people really choose consciously where they live? I'm asking this because I consciously chose to leave my home country behind because I was not satisfied with the situation there and came to Australia and came to Melbourne. But I also experienced that I am not the norm at all. So I'm curious about your experience, whether people really choose where they live and how they live.
Look, well done for continuing this train of thought, because I went down a pathway in responding to your last question about, could I imagine a future where people don't live in cities? I really feel that we have to embrace the way technology has given us lifestyle choices. But what are the trends showing us is that not everybody's going to work remotely 100% of the time, and they're not going to work in an office environment 100% of the time. So it'll be a mixture. And this change, just as an example, this change to the rhythm, to the balance is an adjustment, and that's difficult. Change can be very difficult, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to mean the end. And humans are very good at adjusting and I think really being the drivers of transformation. So I think where we've seen some of those disruptions, it means change. But I come back to what I see as drivers for people being in cities, that there is a scale to opportunity, particularly around work, and that's a really big issue. There is a desire for people to come together as humans with the incredible momentum that is behind big events. People just love coming together, whether it's a sporting event or a cultural event, protest or intellectual sorts of debates and discussions. We found in Melbourne, people will literally come together for a Tiddlywinks competition, and there are whole generations that don't even know what Tiddlywinks are. So I think that humans are drawn to other humans for lots of reasons, which we've touched on in many ways in this conversation. And that drive won't change. I think back to the longest continuing culture in the world that we have here in Australia, and we need to respect and celebrate more. And so much I learned during my time as Lord Mayor, not least of which is that the different groups within the Kulin Nation used to gather on the banks of the Yarra to have big, important conversations about education and trade, for example, and that those activities all occurred when the 5 tribes of the Kulin Nation would come together and have those conversations and share the stories and make decisions. And as the longest continuing culture in the world's been doing that for more than 65,000 years, I think that drive around people and humanity will continue. For me, we will see people coming together, but the way that we do that and the results that we expect need to continually improve and change and morph. Melbourne, for so many years, went out as a city. We had the luxury of a relatively flat topography and a relatively affordable land and a planning system that enabled an ever-expanding urban growth zone, a luxury that many cities don't have. This seemed, and it fueled our growth for decades. And I guess the other foible of human beings is that we can get so caught up in the things going well that we're not always asking, as you are, Fanny, the tough questions to ensure that we're thinking about where those disruptions are going to happen and how we have to continually transform. But of course, we know in our more recent history that ever expanding is an ever decreasing option for us to be able to afford. I acknowledge that it might be more affordable to buy a house and land on the outskirts of the city, but it's not an affordable way to live when we don't have unlimited resources at government levels to be able to deliver all of the necessary infrastructure, whether that's transport, health, education, and of course as a private sector to disperse resources in that way can be very inefficient. And so we've seen now a lot of the housing stress and a lot of the financial stress has really come, unfortunately, to those who are living further out from cities. Some of the work we did around housing stress at the City of Melbourne revealed that people with place-based jobs who are absolutely essential to the city economy and its vibrancy and success, that more than 30% of people in those place-based jobs were travelling more than 3 hours every day to get to their work. And it's just not acceptable. So this sense of constant questioning and challenging, I call it challenge to improve. It's a positive thing. We really do need to keep doing that because up is good as well. And I don't think it's an or discussion ever when we're talking about these topics. It's an and discussion. And how do we make all of these things happen well so that people do have a genuine choice that suits them, but still gives them the greatest access to equity and equality. I know I'm talking very high level now, but these are important principles. And as it is with humans, we like to make a few mistakes over and over again, and then we incrementally improve until we absolutely have to, and then we can find really big steps forward. But now is the time for those very deliberate leap changes in the way that we organise ourselves, better lives and livelihoods for everyone.
We have been dancing around this question, and we might need to change based on just your answer now. What are the 3 biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you? And I'm saying that we might need to change it because these might just be challenges to improve.
It's one of those things, isn't it? Whenever somebody says a weakness, you can think of an opportunity. And if somebody thinks of a threat, you can think of a strength to go to counterbalance it. I do think that we've got some fears naturally. I think fears make us ambitious and responsive and they propel to action. So I'm all embracing of those sorts of conversation. And we frankly don't have enough honest conversations about these things. I know that from every day in the media, we see safety as an issue and we see emotional responses, which are valid. So I think that's important to take the pulse and to understand those emotions. But not enough do we actually go further to address the issues and really identify the challenges, the fears, and drill down into them to see how we can overcome them. So I think good on you for asking those sorts of questions. I do fear that we will become more one-dimensional in the way that we plan for our now and our future, and that's not how people are. Nobody is one-dimensional, and it's not how city or urban environments should be either. We tend, with the way some of the debates work, to move to one extreme or another, and we really need a combination of a lot of things. A lot of people think of urban environments as having no nature, but actually a huge amount of investment is to retrofit nature back into our cities. I think in Melbourne, we're lucky that we've got so many magnificent parks and tree-lined streets, but we need so much more of that to be able to deal with the shocks of climate change, for example, but also really ease some of the equity issues. I mentioned heat earlier. Cooler cities would have a manifest difference for those that suffer from extreme heat the most, just as an example. That sense of becoming one-dimensional in our debates, one-dimensional in our responses, one-dimensional in our outcomes is a fear of mine, and making sure that we continue to have platforms that bring in the multiplicity and diversity of views is important. But of course, as we're seeing in so many ways, being able to have respectful disagreements is something perhaps we're losing the art of. We have to find ways to get back to that, to find real progress, because we've got to challenge the status quo. We've got to deal with fears and challenges and to be able to do that in courageous ways. And you can only do that if people feel safe to have different views or to bring a different perspective. The idea of deliberative democracy processes, they're called all sorts of different things, but I'm most familiar with the term deliberative democracy, where you bring diverse groups of people together who are unrelated and random in some ways, but they're relevant to a topic. And you provide them with data and evidence and research and access to experts to listen, to question, when they have the opportunity to hear the perspectives and the fears and the hopes of other people also impacted by that issue or that place or that ambition. Those sorts of environments tend to lead to more considered consensus, even if they're different to what people might have thought when they first walked into the room. And even if they don't agree with that position, they can understand why the group got to that decision, which most change makers will tell you is fine. You don't have to have everybody agreeing, but everybody understanding why is a really important step to change. But a very long answer to that fear of mine, and I've seen it in so many ways, and we see it in very public ways around our communities at the moment. The other thing is around not responding quickly enough to the biggest challenges that we've got. And I really think government could possibly consider playing a different role in this going forward as well. Governments need to step in where there's market failure or where services are required, where long-term planning is necessary. But private not-for-profit sector and philanthropy sectors, our community sector, NGO sectors, everyone has a valuable role to play. And government's naturally very risk averse, which is weird because actually government's supposed to step into the areas with most risk. But sometimes I think we could do more with partnerships where we let other sectors lead. And I say we because all of us in some way, shape or form are involved in government, little g government. It's an imperative part of the experience I had being Lord Mayor is to understand all of us actually have a responsibility on these issues. Coming into local government, I'd been in lots of different leadership roles and I would happily take responsibility for things that were relevant to my organisation. There were so many other issues and occurrences happening where I would think, I'm interested in that, I know it's important, but it's somebody else's responsibility to manage and resolve it. Actually, we all have a role to play in resolving big issues. That sense of leaning in but also stepping out of the way at appropriate times is another area where I think we could have more evolving conversations and more mature conversations. In Victoria and Australia, we used to be highly regarded. I worked in London in the, when was it? 2000s. We were revered as leaders in public-private partnerships. I was so proud that we would have organisations and governments from around the world coming to ask questions about how we did these PPPs. And we need PPPs on steroids to be able to move at a pace to achieve the change. That we need more of those partnerships where we're sharing risks as appropriate, sharing resources as appropriate and moving at a pace And I think there are so many reasons why that can be enhanced, and technology and embracing technology is one of those.
It comes clear that you are not a fearful person because you are already talking about the opportunities within those fears. And you also mentioned previously that one of the biggest opportunity for cities is creating better outcomes. What are the 3 biggest opportunities you can think of regarding the future of cities?
Places for people to live. Very often, cities are associated with industry and work, which is true. So I'm taking that as a given. I think the opportunity to more closely intertwine housing and housing density as appropriate, density done well, into our cities, and that mix is critical because I think it better reflects the lifestyles that we have these days. That's a big opportunity. And even in Melbourne, which has the City of Melbourne, a municipality which has higher densities than a lot of municipalities around it, we've still got incredible capacity for more people to live. And when we saw the downturn in Melbourne in the 1980s, I was a young worker. There was a big financial crisis. It was very much the municipality a place for people to work. In fact, in the Hoddle grid in those days, there were 685 people living in the Hoddle grid. Yes, 685. In the Hoddle grid today, it's working its way up to 60,000 people living in the same environment. And I remember as a young worker in the city, walking through the city thinking, is this a place where I'm going to be able to actually feel I can fulfill my potential and my passions and the things I want to pursue? Because it just felt so dead, basically. It had really lost its energy and its vibrancy and its offers to people. And of course, fast forward, postcode 3000, one of the most transformative urban policies still in our lifetime, I would say, changed fundamentally many things, but one of them as a core pillar was planning to favour residential development. And it's one of my happiest things when I walk down the streets, even in Central City, and I live in Carlton, where you see people walking into office buildings and people walking out of residential buildings in the same block, people walking their dogs in the morning or their kids to a tram stop, just as the trams have people pouring out to go to retail, hospitality or office environments, or go and rehearse a cultural pursuit or practice an instrument or go to an education institution or access health services, all of those things. I think that's incredibly important, but really driven cities being places for people to live. So I think that's one of the big opportunities. And how we reinvent ourselves is changing the way that we look at how we live. And within that is definitely design. I know you're an architect and you'll have a particular interest in this. We've been too one-dimensional in concepts of the way that people live. We need to give far more choice to lifestyles. And we should be building to minimum standards, but sometimes the product will be a product that doesn't suit everyone. Might only suit a small proportion, but it still gives them the opportunity. Say, of course, I'm talking about smaller apartments there, but I'm also reminded in so many of our high-rise towers that we haven't built for families and we haven't considered equitable ways of living. I went to visit a building in London where all of the one-bedroom apartments were on the top floor, not penthouse apartments that had one family, but apartments where the majority of people could live, and the big family apartments were closer to the ground so that they weren't lugging their prams and multiple grocery bags up, and other very practical reasons. We've seen buildings where there is a lot of shared services and infrastructure, whether it's shared laundries through, of course, to shared open spaces. These things are all possible, and we just need to see more of that diversity in how we live. And that, to me, is a really big opportunity. It's an imperative. The lists of people experiencing homelessness, the lists of people waiting for accommodation, just unacceptable. And it hasn't been at the top of the pops on election campaigns for way, way too long. So I think that's one. The other one that I'm really excited about is the way that scale can actually bring solutions to mitigating and particularly adapting to climate change. It is the biggest global challenge of our lifetime. Everything from how do we plant more trees and introduce more biodiversity to urban environments is exciting. And we're seeing so many of those initiatives, but not at scale yet. And that certainly helps with both mitigation and adaptation through to how we become renewable energy networks that are self-sustaining and really take the pressure off the planet. And that is possible when you have big groups of people living near each other. We should feel really positive about the transformation that we can create. The knowledge and the know-how is there now. It's about application and that buy-in to transforming our energy systems. I know that there'll be bumps along the way, and I absolutely acknowledge that we have to balance the coordination of energy systems because we want to continue with our lifestyle. I think that's why we choose to be in more developed nations, in cities as a whole, and it's certainly what we'd like to see developing cities and nations be able to leap from their current situation, not to go through all of the steps that have led to degradation of our environment and to have accelerated climate change, for them to leap over that into a better future for everyone. So I'm excited about what that opportunity presents in cities.
Sally, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I don't want to keep you all night, although I could ask you for hours. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
My role now is as an active citizen, firstly. It's to be interested and engaged and informed. It's to ask lots of questions and to not assume that it's somebody else's responsibility. It's a small action or bigger actions. All of us need to take ownership. And so I'm a much more active and interested and involved citizen than I ever was before. And I'm so grateful for that transformation in my own life and my family and broader network. It's been a gift from my perspective. That's the first thing. And then in every organisation that I work with and work in, it's important that I play a leadership role to incorporate these elements of transformation and challenging to improve and a focus on the big issues into my day-to-day. And it is surprising at how many levers we all have in our day-to-day roles to use expertise, to use procurement, to use conversations, to look at collaborations and partnerships, to be involved in shaping our cities and to be leaders, whether you have a title or you don't, of that sort. And again, I am very motivated by that. One of the incredible reflections for me of the disruption and trauma of the pandemic and across Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, was to see the inspiring way that people can respond in those very extreme situations. And I guess I would encourage all of us, without creating other issues, to really be energised by the stage that we're at around some of these big challenges. The time is now, and to think more deeply about that in how we conduct ourselves every day. So even though I am no longer the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, I'm no longer an elected representative, and I no longer have responsibility for some of those big picture things that we've talked about today in terms of policies and programs and projects, I deeply understand the role that I can play in my private professional capacity to create change and be part of the transformation. And I know that in doing that, I'm leaving my indelible fingerprints on the future. And it'd be wonderful, and I know you feel the same way, if through conversations like your podcast, I know that you are motivating and inspiring people to feel that same sense of responsibility, but also motivation and inspiration about making sure that every day counts, every action counts. And there's a euphoria in that as well as an exhaustion. So I acknowledge the balance, but mostly there's that sense of exhilaration that comes from knowing that you're doing something positive.
Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
So many. But I really think that if people are listening to you, then they're already opting in to these topics and they recognise that it's not just interesting, but that it's important. And I think acknowledging your leadership in creating platforms and conversations like this that can be shared so broadly is critical. And I'm grateful for that. You're a good example of somebody who's taking responsibility and taking action for creating something that's more positive. Everybody's got different issues, different resources, different capacity. I completely get that. But some of the most amazing things I saw during the pandemic came from people that others might have thought had the least opportunity to make a difference, and yet they did. So for everyone who's listening, I'd really encourage you to be a bit more thoughtful and active in understanding how your actions can make a positive difference for society. And in doing that, really that's the power of cities. We want it by X10, X100, exponential, and that comes through really the combination of all of the little decisions and actions we take every day. And of course, I want to say to everybody, keep listening to this incredible podcast about cities. They're absolutely essential to our progress as humans and humanity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to hear from Sally about the need for respectful disagreements, to learn and gain new experiences and allow experiments to happen in the urban fabric. Not to mention her advocacy for affordable housing. Rob Pradolin talked about affordable housing for Australians in episode 264 in detail. You can find out more about Sally online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Sally's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?